Today, I drove 40 miles to go meet a group of men from an arm wrestling club to basically see how my gym strength would hold up against their arm wrestling abilities. So, I've trained for years. I can bench press 180 kilos. I've always considered myself naturally strong. But lifting a barbell in a controlled environment is completely different to actually arm wrestling somebody. So I didn't genuinely know how it would pan out. I didn't know what would happen, but the results surprised me. This is a group of men who are from an arm wrestling club and have been practicing for a while, some seriously big dudes. And right handed, I managed to beat everyone that I pulled. Left handed, I lost a few, but still did considerably better than I expected overall. Obviously, I enjoyed winning. I'm competitive, and there would be no point pretending otherwise. But I think what interests me most about this whole experience is that what it reveals about strength itself, because gym strength absolutely matters, but strength is only part of the equation. Gym strength has given me a serious advantage in the game of arm wrestling. The first thing I learned is that years of heavy training does transfer. Pressing strength, back strength, grip strength, forearm, shoulders, and general physical confidence all helped in the games which I had, in the matches which I had. Now, I'm sure some of the guys weren't actually going full swing, but it seemed like some of them definitely were. You cannot spend years moving heavy weights and expect none of it to carry over. When the match started, I could feel that I had enough raw strength to resist people, to hold them, apply pressure, keep my wrists strong, keep the cup, and sometimes just simply overpower them and press them to the pad. So ultimately, I don't agree with the idea that gym strength is, fake or useless. Strength is strength at the end of the day. Building a powerful upper body gives you a foundation that transfers into a lot of physical situations. But a foundation in strength is not the same as a finished skill. The longer I spent with these men, I was there for about 2 hours. I pulled a bunch of arm wrestles, left arm, right arm, left arm, right arm. The more obvious it became that arm wrestling is not simply two people holding hands and pushing as hard as possible. There's a lot of technique involved, and to actually arm wrestle a bunch of guys who know what they're doing was refreshing, because I've arm wrestled people in pubs. I can't get my words out. I've arm wrestled people, growing up, friends, brothers. I've always done arm wrestles, and I've always kind of won. But to do it properly on a proper table, to match up with a bunch of guys who have been in the game for a little while, really shows you that there is a lot of technique and skill and small things that you don't really notice if you're just watching an arm wrestling match on YouTube, for example. Technique changes everything. Arm wrestling has positions, leverages, hand control, and angles that I've barely begun to understand. There's certain movements and there's certain positions you get to in an arm wrestling match which have seemed very precarious. Where you place your elbow matters, how you control the other person's hand matters, your wrist position matters, your shoulder position matters. Even the direction in which you apply force changes the match. Even where your feet go matters. Some of the men were teaching me that small adjustments. I could immediately, when they were teaching me these small adjustments, I could immediately feel the difference. And that matters. You can be physically stronger than somebody overall, but if they understand how to take your wrist, remove your leverage, and pull you into a weak position, your strength becomes far harder to use. And I think that's ultimately the biggest lesson I've probably learned this evening. Strength is not only what you possess, it is what you can apply and from what position you can apply it from. The gym measures strength in controlled conditions. The bar follows a familiar path, a straight line essentially. The weight doesn't change its strategy halfway through the repetition. Bench pressing would be much harder if halfway up the bench press it decided to just go that way. Thankfully it's completely controlled when you're in the gym. But when you're in a match, you might be doing a particular movement and the other person changes strategy and they pull you back or they twist their wrist or they do something. They react and they adjust. They can attack the weakest parts of your position, and I definitely felt that was happening tonight. And that turns strength into something more complicated and more interesting. I think specific strength matters. I also noticed that experienced arm wrestlers have developed strength in places most people barely train. The hand, the wrist, the fingers, the connective tissues around the elbows, the ability to maintain pressure, serious amounts of pressure in very awkward positions. A person might not look as physically imposing as the strongest man in the commercial gym, but they may have years of highly specific strength that only becomes obvious when you meet them at the table. And I think this applies to almost every physical skill, to be honest. Strong powerlifter is not automatically an excellent fighter. A muscular bodybuilder is not automatically a fast runner. Every sport teaches the body how to express strength in a specific way. General strength gives you potential. Practice teaches you how to use it. I think this evening winning was useful, but also losing was useful too. I'm pleased that I performed well. Beating everybody right-handed gave me the evidence that my training has built genuine transferable strength and that my technique is probably pretty good for a complete novice. The few matches which I lost on the left arm were probably equally as valuable, if not more valuable, because you always learn from where you lose more than where you win. Losing exposes that the winning. The winning. So for losing can expose what winning hides. Because if you win, you just do it again, and you don't really learn much in that process. But when you lose, you kind of makes you think about everything. It shows you where your position breaks down. It reveals where somebody understands the movement better than you, and it gives you a reason to improve. There is something healthy about being placed in a situation where you cannot simply tell yourself that you're strong. You have to demonstrate it against somebody else who is actively trying to beat you. There is no motivational quote involved. There's no flattering camera angle, no carefully chosen personal best. It's not like a PR in a gym. You grip hands, somebody says go, then you find out. That kind of honest feedback, I think, is good for people. And this brings me on to the topic of that. Men definitely need healthy competition. The other part I enjoyed of this evening's experience was simply the atmosphere. Everybody wants to win. People were competitive, but there was also 100% respect, advice, humor, encouragement, and nobody needed to pretend that the competition was offensive or unhealthy. You could try beat someone, shake their hand, and afterwards, help each other improve. And that's a great thing to do and a great thing to be involved in. I think more men need more environments like that. Maybe this is one of the reasons why certain things in society seem to be on the decline, because men simply don't have these places they can go where they're with a bunch of other men doing a similar thing where they can test themselves in a healthy way. A lot of men struggle to build friendships through formal conversations about, connection, but give them something physical, give them a physical challenge, a shared interest, and something to compete over, then the friendship begins naturally. Men don't always bond by sitting in a circle discussing how to bond. Sometimes they bond by trying to beat each other and shaking hands afterwards. That seems like a very manly thing. You know, Competition does not have to involve hatred. It can produce, and probably does more often than not, produce mutual respect. You discover what somebody else is capable of. You find out what you're capable of, and whether you win or lose, you leave with a more honest understanding of yourself. And I think what I actually learned is that gym strength the same as real strength. I actually think real strength is probably the wrong phrase. Ultimately, gym strength is real. Arm wrestling strength is real. So our fighting strength, manual strength, athletic strength, and mental strength, probably the most important of all, required to keep going when something becomes difficult. They are different expressions of the same broader quality. And my years in the gym gave me enough raw power to perform surprisingly well on my first visit to this arm wrestlers club. But they did not instantly give me the technique, tendon conditioning, or positioning knowledge of somebody who I spent years practicing arm wrestling. My years in the gym, have basically got me to a point of being extremely strong, but it's not teaching me the intricacies of the sport of arm wrestling. And I think this is what's making, learning the new physical skill very exciting. You arrive with certain strengths, then the activity itself exposes everything you haven't deployed yet or developed yet. I think I'll be definitely going back because ultimately I performed well, probably better than I thought I would have. I enjoyed the competition, but mainly because I left knowing that, there's a whole skill underneath something that appears incredibly simple from the outside. Whereas when you get on the inside, it's a very different story. The gym can build your strength, but competition reveals how effective you can actually use it. And sometimes the best way to understand what you're actually capable of is to leave the environment where you feel strong already and test yourself somewhere new. This is Jake O'Neill Talks, honest commentary, modern life.